Okay, so as Al said, the title this morning was originally Ezra's Return. I'll move my phone. That help? I don't know who's making it. And then I did do a quick theological check with him this morning and said, Ezra wasn't returning at all, was he? He'd never been there originally. Ezra was born in exile, so I have renamed it Ezra and the Second Return of Exiles, Ezra 7 and 8. And I found this picture, which was from a synagogue in Syria, dated about 240 AD, and that's thought to depict Ezra. As you know, we've been going through a series on the minor prophets and the history from that period. And we've had some really good talks, and one that really spoke to me was actually when Rich and Rach did their family service, and Rach and I had a brief chat about it last week, saying that when they got their title, which was Apathy and Opposition, oh, and it's a family service, how do you do that? And it's probably more memorable for me because the following week I had to do an impromptu Sunday school, and I picked up on the 3 points which Rich brought, which were distractions, disappointments, and dastardly deeds. Now, there haven't been too many dastardly deeds in this last week. There have not been too many disappointments, but many of you will realise there have been quite a lot of distractions. Now, this was a very nice distraction, which most of you would not be aware of. The lady in the... Can I point with it?
Yeah, that's not a problem.
Top button, maybe.
It was working.
Okay, the lady in the pink to the bottom left as you look at it is our best man's wife. She normally lives in Canada, and she was over for the last week or so on what turned out to be quite a complicated visit. But I had some time off in lieu on Monday morning, and so did several other of my friends, and we went over and spent a couple of hours with her, and it was just a really lovely time. But of course, when I take time off, nobody does my job when I'm not there, so I've started the month going sort of woo. But that was a lovely distraction to have. Some of you will be more aware of this one. Very significant in the Neal household. And this one, Andy Murray's last, turns out, the Neals at Wimbledon. And this one, caused my husband to get up in the middle of the night and me to get up ridiculously early on Friday morning as well. That one, hopefully more to come today. And then, see, Steve said to me, "Are you done?" yesterday afternoon, and I said nearly, because then there was this one. So what a week of distractions it's been. But I'm hoping that God has nevertheless spoken. Al has said that with this series, some of it is lists of names, some of it is very much history of who came with whom, etc. So what I've tried to do is summarise these 2 chapters and then pull out some points from them. So, we're now in Artaxerxes' reign in Babylon, and he is permitting another group of Jews to return to Jerusalem. Supposedly about 1,500 men. There's a list of them, and if you add them up, that's about what you get to. And of course the list was the men, so the total group would have been around 5,000 people. And in chapter 8, verses 1 to 14, it lists the family groups who returned. And Ezra is one of the people who returned. He was a teacher well versed in the law of Moses. There's not so much about his teaching in these 2 chapters, and I was trying desperately not to get onto that too much because of what Tom's going to be sharing next week. But although, I don't know a lot about the exile, but it does seem there were some things that they were very much allowed to do, and he had been able to devote himself to the study and observance of the law of the Lord and to teaching its decrees and laws in Israel. And so then Artaxerxes, like one of the kings before him, issued a decree, and this second wave of returnees are also sent back to Jerusalem with silver, gold, freewill offerings, like happened the first time. And so then this is what happened. This is briefer in my notes because I'm going to dwell more on some of these things. So they prayed and fasted before they set off. They did an inventory of everything they took. They arrived safely, all 5,000, with all their stuff. They checked everything they brought with them, and then they worshipped in the temple. I'm going to do this slightly in a reverse order, but you may see why in the end. So the first thing I wanted to pick up on is that worship matters, and I think that has flown through very much from what we have been singing this morning. Worship matters now just as much as it did then. I do find this fascinating that Artaxerxes, a foreign king, acknowledges this. So in chapter 7, verse 17, he says, "With this money be sure to buy bulls, rams and male lambs, together with their grain offerings and drink offerings, and sacrifice them on the altar of the temple of your God in Jerusalem." That's quite amazing when you think about it, isn't it? A foreign king who does not worship the God of Israel, nevertheless, lets them go and sends them back with the things they need to be able to worship. You know, presumably as exiles they didn't have the funds themselves to go and buy everything they need, but it was given to them. And in chapter 7 verse 19, "Deliver to the God of Jerusalem all the articles entrusted to you for worship in the temple of your God, and anything else needed for the temple of your God that you are responsible to supply, you may provide from the royal treasury." It's quite a thing, isn't it? A foreign god giving his favour to them. There is a bit of a question about whether there's a hint of self-interest. Evidently, several of these kings were in the habit of letting the exiles from other faiths return as well, because they were in some ways trying to cover themselves. In verse 23 of chapter 7 it says, "Whatever the God of heaven has prescribed, let it be done with diligence for the temple of the God of heaven. Why should his wrath fall on the realm of the king and of his sons?" So his motives aren't necessarily completely pure, but he permits the Israelites to go back. The Jews pray and fast before they set off. "There by the Ahava Canal I proclaimed a fast, so that we might humble ourselves before our God, and ask him for a safe journey for us and our children, with all our possessions. I was ashamed to ask the king for soldiers and horsemen to protect us from enemies on the road, because we had told the king, 'The gracious hand of our God is on everyone who looks to him, but his great anger is against all who forsake him.' So we fasted and petitioned our God about this, and he answered our prayer." Obviously there's a funny little bit in there, isn't it? He's made these big promises about his God to the king, and he's like, "Oh, but I can't really ask for any practical, natural help now, so it's all on God." But of course we know it is all on God anyway. God provides, God protects, and sometimes that can be in the natural protection. They could have had people escorting them out, but in fact, because he was a bit embarrassed, he didn't seek that. But they all set off and arrived safely eventually. And Ezra recognises that he needs the right people in the temple. So in chapter 7 verse 16 he summoned I've got one of these lovely long lists, haven't I? Eleazar, Ariel, Shemaiah, Elnathan, Jarib, Elnathan, another Elnathan I think, not my typing error, Nathan, Zechariah and Meshullam, who were leaders, and Jarib and Elnathan, who were men of learning. And I ordered them to go to Iddo, the leader in Cassiphia. I told them what to say to Iddo and his fellow Levites, the temple servants in Cassiphia, so that they might bring attendance to us for the house of our God. Now, from what I understand, Ezra was a priest, but he wasn't a high priest, so he needed to get the right people around him in the temple. And that is honouring of God, isn't it? That is how God had commanded worship to take place in the Old Testament. And so Ezra, with all that admin that he had to do, thinking back to what Simon said last week about the amount of holy admin, he was trying to get 5,000 people a long distance, and he'd also got to find these extra special people. And they did things properly when they got back. Chapter 8, verse 35. Then the exiles who had returned from captivity sacrificed burnt offerings to the God of Israel. 12 bulls for all Israel, 96 rams, 77 male lambs, and as a sin offering, 12 male goats. All this was a burnt offering to the Lord. So a burnt offering was often a substitute for the individual Israelite in their journey of worship towards God. So that brought them fellowship with God. And then, as a sin offering, obviously that brings cleansing of sins through the blood of the lamb and the removal of sins. And of course, as Simon said last week, and I will say again, and as we've been singing, you know, for now, we have one lamb who sacrificed himself for the whole of humanity, which is Jesus. And that gives us access to the throne room, to the King of Kings. And obviously in these days there was so much rigmarole, wasn't there, to be able to access God. And we have that freedom now. So, a few questions. Can we become a bit blasé about God's help? In this country, I suspect we don't often pray when we set off on a journey. I think those of you who've been to Africa will come across people who will always pray before they set out. Do we become blasé about God helping us? Do we take our worship for granted? We do think, as much as we can, about the persecuted church, where worship is difficult, worship is sometimes hindered or banned. Do we, as Christians living in this lovely area, being able to meet together on a Sunday morning, take our worship for granted? And do we come with the right attitude? As you know, in the New Testament, there are various passages about coming humbly, coming having righted any wrongs before you arrive, making sure that you are at peace with your neighbour. Do we come with the right attitude, or do we just rock up on a Sunday morning and think, here we are, it's that time again? So there's a couple of challenges there. And another thing which I loved in this passage, integrity matters. Ezra takes an inventory. Chapter 7, verse 24. Then I set apart 12 of the leading priests, namely Sherebiah, Hashabiah, and 10 of their brothers, and I weighed out to them the offering of silver and gold and the articles that the king, his advisers, his officials, and all Israel present there had donated for the house of our God. I weighed out to them 650 talents of silver, silver articles weighing 100 talents, 100 talents of gold, 20 bowls of gold valued at 1,000 darics, and 2 fine articles of polished bronze, as precious as gold. I said to them, you as well as these articles are consecrated to the Lord. The silver and gold are a freewill offering to the Lord, the God of your ancestors. Guard them carefully until you weigh them out in the chambers of the house of the Lord in Jerusalem, before the leading priests and the Levites and the family heads of Israel. Then the priests and Levites received the silver and gold and sacred articles that had been weighed out to be taken to the house of our God in Jerusalem. So they have a lot of stuff there, quite heavy stuff, and they have taken it from Babylon back to Jerusalem. And then, now accountants, please forgive me, is this reasonable? Ezra does a stock take when they get back. I've never worked with widgets and things where you have to count your stuff. It's always been more ethereal than that. On the 4th day, chapter 8, verse 33, in the house of our God. So actually they got back and they rested for 3 days after their long journey. And in the house of their God, We weighed out the silver and gold and the sacred articles into the hands of Meremoth, son of Uriah the priest. Eleazar, the son of Phinehas, was with him, and so were the Levites, Jozabad, son of Jeshua, and Noadiah, son of Binri. Everything was accounted for by number and weight, and the entire weight was recorded at that time. And I mean, you wouldn't be surprised that I love that, would you? The accuracy, the recording, it all fits, it all reconciles. But it's something that, as a nation, we've been thinking about quite a lot in the last few years, isn't it? Integrity. And another question, how diligent are we with what God has entrusted to us? Our time, our talents, and our money. We read in the parable of the talents that actually we're not supposed to hoard it all away, are we? We're supposed to give of all of those things to God, and actually that it's His first. So there's another interesting question that came to me from this passage. You know, they have been really careful to make sure that everything they were given is accounted for so that it is then able to be used in the worship of God. So how do we worship God with those things, with our time, with our talents and our money? And then the bigger point, which I am going to end with, God is in control. However things may seem, however you may feel. I was reflecting about the election. For those of us, mainly in our room, actually I know we've got at least one person who's not from this constituency, either you will have voted for somebody who didn't get elected, or you will have voted for somebody who got elected but whose party does not have a significant amount of power in the current government. So we may feel we're powerless, but God is in control. And Jesus tells us that life will not be easy. John 16 says, I've told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. So we're not promised a lack of trouble, but we are promised peace even in the trouble. And when I was reading through this, and I think a few times in our series, I have been thinking about how amazing these kings were. Darius and Artaxerxes, and then I think Cyrus in the middle sort of checked the documentation to say, yes, they're allowed to be there, yes, they're allowed to be rebuilding the temple. And it took me back to Pharaoh, a sort of king. His heart was hardened every time the plagues abated. Moses was commanded by God to go to Pharaoh and say, please let my people go. And Pharaoh said, no, I won't let the people go. And then there was a plague, and then he said, maybe, and then he said no. And that happened in all of these verses through Exodus, from Exodus chapter 8 to Exodus chapter 11. And then even in chapter 14, verse 8, he had finally given in after all the plagues, and particularly, presumably, the plague of the firstborn. And he'd agreed to let them go, and then his heart was hardened again, and he pursued them right to the point of crossing the Red Sea. And then we have these kings, Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes. Actually, I just got them in the wrong order, didn't I? Cyrus came first. They were willing to make it possible for the Jews to return home. However, that sounds lovely, isn't it? They just go, oh yeah, you can go home now, we're going to let you have all of that money and precious things to take to the temple. But of course, in that situation, all the trouble had come before. They had been taken into exile. They had been born in exile, some of them. And as we know, and Tom I think will share with you next week, there will be some trouble coming ahead as well. But, as Simon said last week, and this is one of my favourite passages in Proverbs actually, the king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. It says in Proverbs 21:1, In the Lord's hand, the king's heart is a stream of water that he channels towards all who please him. So again, as we may feel that things are not in control, in the Lord's hand, the king's heart is a stream of water that he channels towards all who please him. Doesn't mean there won't be trouble, but in the end it does mean that God's in control. In Exodus, it was the Lord who hardened Pharaoh's heart. In Ezra, it was the Lord who moved the heart of Cyrus. And then Darius decreed it for them to continue to build the temple. And similarly, Artaxerxes was moved to let them go back. I've changed this now, so the leader's heart is in the hand of the Lord. I mean, obviously we have a king, but we don't have a king who has an immense amount of constitutional power. But I think this proverb can be applied to the leaders of our nation, of our councils, etc. Ultimately, God is in control, and their actions will be judged by God, and he is overall. So finally, a couple of questions. Does this make us feel more positive about the state of the world? Maybe not currently. We know there are dreadful things happening all around the world, but we can be sure that God is in control.
Amen.
The election results, however we feel, God is in control. And therefore, what is our response? We can consider our attitudes to our worship and our integrity, as well as pray for the integrity of those who lead us, and trust, hope and pray for the situations we find ourselves in, and particularly at this time for a new government and for the leaders of our nation, that God's ways and purposes will be seen.
Amen.
I need to stop buying P&Q, it's getting hard to get up here. Thank you, Kathy. Some very challenging questions there. I'll certainly be thinking about how we pick those up in house group this week.